Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're talking about G.I. Joe. Before we get into that, though, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave a comment. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So, thank you so much for being here. So, having said all that, the prologue to this adventure is just the last adventure, right? And for anybody who didn't hear the last adventure, I'm going to put it in a nutshell for you. The last adventure was the first adventure that I ran in our current series of G.I. Joe stories. And so the prologue to that was just the events of G.I. Joe the movie. And to be very clear, I am referring to the 80s animated G.I. Joe the movie that was made by Sunbow. Sunbow also did the G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero cartoons back in the 80s, right? And Hasbro is the name of the company that owns the actual G.I. Joe franchise. After the 80s animated movie came out, Hasbro took the rights away from Sunbow and gave them to another company called DIC. And I'm friends with a guy named Buzz Dixon, who is he was the senior story editor and writer for the 80s G.I. Joe cartoon. And Buzz had told me that Deke stood for do it cheap. And so the idea was, yes, they were going to save Hasbro money when it came to production costs, but it sacrificed quality to do so. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of fans, certainly myself, feel that the Deke episodes were horrible and that G.I. Joe felt like it had jumped the shark, right? So a lot of fans completely ignore Deke and just say, yeah, that never happened. That doesn't count because, anything Sunbow didn't do doesn't count, basically. So that was what we did with this game. So for the first adventure, the prologue, like I said, was just the events of G.I. Joe the movie. And when that movie ends, we had seen Cobra Commander get turned into an ordinary snake and slither off into the cold of the Himalayas, where we assume he's going to freeze to death since he's cold-blooded, right? Um, Serpentor, who was the leader of Cobra, seemed like maybe he was at ground zero for this massive explosion. So we thought he's out of the picture. You just don't know who would even be running Cobra at this point, right? When the movie ends. So the Joes felt like they had won, but the thing is that was the last thing they remember. So when that adventure began and we got into the main plot of that adventure, the first thing that happens is the Joes wake up in these glass tubes in a Cobra lab. And one of the Joes we mentioned was Shipwreck. And there was this episode of the 80s cartoon where Shipwreck at one point wakes up on this island and he is told that it's the future, right? And it turns out everybody around him is a sort of like a clone. They call them synthoids, but it's kind of like a clone. They're created by Cobra. And so this is all a trick because they're trying to get information out of Shipwreck. They're hoping he will tell one of these other people who he thinks are his friends. He thinks he can confide in them. He has no idea these are, we'll call them clones instead of synthoids, but they are creations of Cobra, right? So when Shipwreck wakes up in a tube and finds out it's the 21st century, for him, this is like deja vu, right? And he's like really disturbed by this. So he's on guard and he like doesn't trust anybody. I mean, really just check out that episode, check out that first episode. I'll drop a link below and that'll tell you everything you need to know. So the Joes split up to learn more about what's going on, to get equipment, so on and so forth. And then one of the Joes named Grunt is from around here, which I set this in Springfield, Ohio. Springfield is a name heavily associated with Cobra. Um, the Ohio thing is going to get explained here in a little bit. We're just not quite to that part yet. But at any rate, they agree to split up, and so they find out the whole town of Springfield, everybody here is Cobra. But a lot of them are like fat and out of shape and stuff and haven't been doing anything since the 80s. You know what I mean? They're old. So the Joes thus far haven't had a whole lot of opposition. And in Springfield, they find a military surplus warehouse, right? A store. And they go there, and this place has kind of like Vietnam era equipment, like, helmets and army boots and flashlights and all that sort of thing. So the Joes equip themselves because when they start off in the glass tubes, they don't have a single thing. They don't even have clothing. So when they got out of the tubes, they had to find clothes and so on and so forth. So like Snake Eyes, for instance, found like a black ski mask that he put on and like a pair of black goggles over top of that. And you know what I mean? Like I made them equip their characters by scrounging around and looking for stuff that was usable. And then while they were there, some quote unquote police officers show up and we find out these are actually Cobra troopers. And so the Joes take them out, commandeer their vehicle. And the plan of all the Joes at this point is to make it to this abandoned farm where they're all going to, again, regroup, share equipment and intel, right? So that's where we left the first adventure. And then that is the prologue to this adventure. I want to say another real quick thing before we get into the story of this. And that is that um, the church that my wife and I attend had game night last night. And yesterday was the day when normally we role play, right? So I was kind of like, man, I don't know if I want to go to game night or if I want to play my role playing game at home. And then it occurred to me when there are so many members of G.I. Joe, I was like, you know what I got to do? We should run it there because it's like a two-story building, and then the top of it is with lined up with like ground level, and that's the sanctuary. The downstairs of it is kind of like a cafeteria sort of a thing, and they have like wedding receptions there and so on and so forth. So we ran the game there last night so that I could have a ton of guys playing the game. You know what I mean? And I thought that would be pretty neat to actually run a G.I. Joe game where you have like an army of players. So I made up character sheets ahead of time for the Joes. Um, and so people that wanted to play the game, we ended up having to put like two cafeteria tables together. So we had people sitting around the whole table. I went to Hobby Lobby and they have those little green army men, right? But then they also had a bag of army men that were in blue and gray for like Civil War stuff. So I bought that bag and then we used the blue guys for the Cobras, which reminded me a little bit. I don't know how many people remember this. Back in the 80s, they had a G.I. Joe train set. It was an HO scale model train, model railroad, but it was G.I. Joe themed, and it came with little army men. And for the Cobras that would attack the train or whatever, that was in kind of like a navy blue. So that was very nostalgic for me to be doing this kind of war gaming on a table with the green and blue guys. That I liked that. But so we had a really good turnout. The one guy, Roger Jenny, is now the oldest person to ever play in our game. He's 74. He played and had a good time. He liked it. And a bunch of these guys, by the way, are Vietnam veterans. And that kind of struck a chord with me because if you look at the old 80s file cards for G.I. Joe, a bunch of the Joes were supposed to be Vietnam veterans. So that was interesting. And it was kind of cool to hear people playing, and like Roger was talking about artillery stuff and so on and so forth. He played bazooka, by the way. But at any rate, it was really good. But because none of these guys had played in the previous game to really understand the overarching story, they're not going to be in the next game. You know what I mean? So because of all that, I honestly I just kept it to combat. And a lot of these guys started off and they'd never ever played a role-playing game before, and they were confused, right? But then after we'd been going for, I'd say, about 20 minutes, they totally understood. And it was really neat to have a table of guys. And I had the bad guys be Cobra bats, by the way. The story simply put is, so all the Joes are in a barn. And so first of all, they're comparing notes, right? So a mysterious benefactor had freed them from this lab they were in, and all they saw was like text on a computer screen. So they have no idea who this guy is yet. But he had warned them, kind of trust no one. Cobra has infiltrated the government, so on and so forth. Which, by the way, um, I got a comment on the last video where people, well, one guy, anyways, thought I was trying to make a statement about modern real world politics. That was not my goal at all. Actually, the inspiration for this was that one Captain America movie where Hydra had infiltrated the government, was going to take over the helicarriers, right? That was kind of the inspiration for this, was sort of Hydra running the government. I'm just replacing Hydra with Cobra. At any rate, though, so when the Joes all get together in this old abandoned barn to sort of exchange notes, they learn that there is this guy um, called Super Trooper. And I feel like very few people are going to know anything about Super Trooper. His real name is Paul Latimer, and he's from Dayton, Ohio. And that is why I said earlier we're going to mention the Ohio thing. So this guy is running for president because this is set a few months back, right? This is pre-election. So this guy Latimer is is the front runner to become the next president of the United States. And when they look into him, first of all, none of the Joes have any idea who this guy is. They've never heard of him because the last thing they remember are the events of G.I. Joe, the movie, right? So that's kind of where we cut things off and said characters after that are are not around. And so they find out that this Latimer guy claims to have been a member of G.I. Joe, and he claims to have sort of been like the ultimate Joe. He was sort of like stronger than everybody else and faster than everybody else and smarter than everybody else, and like he can speak all these languages and yada yada yada, right? And and by the way, this was Super Trooper was a toy GI Joe put out in the 80s. Feel free to Google it, by the way. It had like chrome silver parts, and to me, as a GI Joe fan, even as a kid, I remember seeing this coming out and thinking, this guy seems kind of weird. Like he doesn't quite have the same vibe that the previous stuff had. You know what I mean? He seemed a little like cartoony or something. I don't know how to put it. But at any rate, so the Joes are hearing about this guy for the first time. They're like, we have no idea who this guy is. But then Mainframe, who's the Joe computer expert, who is now, he seems way more useful in a world with internet, right? So in Mainframe, while he was, like I said, everybody kind of split up, did their own thing. Now they've come back together again. So Mainframe was learning all sorts of stuff on the internet that he is telling everybody else now, right? So he tells them this Latimer guy who claims he's a veteran of G.I. Joe seems like he's going to be the next president of the United States, and that the people who are spending the most money to try to make that happen, like one of them, for instance, is Destro, who owns a company called Mars. So Mars has spent a ton of money on Latimer's campaign, right? And so the Joes are sort of going over this information and they're like, this doesn't really make sense, right? Like, what is going on? Like, did Destro reform and this Latimer guy is the real deal? Like, what is going on? And they're very confused. And then the person running against Latimer is a woman, and they don't recognize her name or anything like that. Um, and she is, her parents both were media uh investigative journalists, right? Back in the day. So the Joes are just looking at this and they don't really understand what's going on yet, right? So we have a mystery. They need to do some legwork to get anywhere. Well, so as they're going over this, the thing that they have overlooked is last game when they stole the police SUV, it has GPS and stuff like that in it, right? And the Joes aren't used to that technology. So they didn't realize that by stealing that piece of Cobra equipment instead of doing a civilian thing, they have led Cobra right to the farm. And so Cobra bats surround the property and they come marching in. By the way, I ran this in GURPS. So I had the bats, marching towards the barn relatively slowly to make them seem more robotic and stuff like that. And so then all the Joes stick their weapons out of slats because, for instance, I grew up on a farm and that barn is literally falling apart, right? And so there was a place where we used to store corn for the animals to eat. And we call it a corn crib. And so it had slats that would have maybe about an inch between each slat, maybe 2 inches, I don't know. Um, but point being, with age, the wood is kind of like rotting, because the barn is like over 100 years old for sure. So the wood is kind of like shriveling up in a way, like it's just getting worse from exposure to the elements. Some of the slats fall off, so on and so forth. So the advantage of this is the Joes can see out at the bad guys, but the bad guys are having a really hard time seeing in at the Joes. But that means the Joes can, think of it like arrow slits in a castle, right? So they're able to stick the guns out and take shots. And then Scarlet and Bazooka go out the back door. They both go around the side of a barn. Scarlet took cover behind a rain barrel full of gross water because nobody had done anything with it for ages. So it was this like scummy rainwater in this barrel. So she would, pop out from the side of the barrel, take a shot at a Cobra guy, and then take cover again. Bazooka, played by Roger Jenny, the 74-year-old guy, right? He pops around from behind the barn. He got a really nice critical success. First shot in the game was he shot a Cobra bat in the face with a literal bazooka. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, it was just to shoot him up. So the Joes keep shooting Cobras until there are no Cobras left. Mainframe then in the epilogue to this adventure um, goes through all of the, because Cobra showed up with police SUVs, cruisers, squad cars, so on and so forth, right? And then the Joes loot the bodies, so then they're able to take um, pistols, um, night sticks, handcuffs, flashlights, walkie talkies, you name it, right? And then a bunch of the Joes too are talking about putting on these clothes and trying to pass themselves off as Cobra troopers and like, let's actually try to infiltrate the organization. Like, where do we physically have to go to infiltrate them? Basically, rip off the end of, or not the end of Star Wars, but the part in the first Star Wars movie where Luke and Han dress up like stormtroopers, right? That's kind of what the Joes were talking about at the end of the adventure. So the epilogue to this one is they are not quite sure where to go next, but they had dealt with all these guys that came after them, and that was it. It was fun. It was a lot of fun, actually. Um, I don't often get a chance to run a game with like just a ton of players, but when I do, that can be a lot of fun. We're not going to be doing that next week. In next week's game, it's going to go back to the small group of people of like Duke, Scarlet, Snake Eyes, Jinx, that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, that was it for this one. We enjoyed playing it. We hope you enjoyed hearing about it. If so, as always, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Yo, Joe.